Okay, I'm going to take a few minutes, actually the rest of the time, and gradually take you through some more recent things that we've been working on. Hopefully, those have value to you, and and we can talk about any issues that you want to. So I'm going to try and give kind of a general overview of some recent research. We'll talk mostly about some corn processing and grains that we've been testing. Won't touch much on some novel feeds, but want to mention that here that we're working on some feeds that will modify the fat profile and also potentially methane. We'll touch on inogen and inogen corn, some summary of work we've done over time, and then very briefly talk about silage and particularly how it fits with liver abscesses. Do want to highlight that we have a posting on our beef website. It's this beef.unl.edu 2020 Silage Beef Cattle Conference. Was co-hosted with Iowa State and Lalaman. Was going to have a large silage conference here in eastern Nebraska last summer, and of course things got changed for us, so we went to 4 virtual presentations and pretty good material. It's all recorded and available. As always, our beef reports and everything's at beef.unl.edu. So I want to start with some processing of corn. This is a recent trial we did. We looked at a roller mill. Actually, Automatic Ag is a company based here in eastern Nebraska, and they approached us and had a new roller mill design and wanted to see, okay, what happens if we process dry corn with this roller, high moisture corn at the time of putting it up in the bunker. And so we fed those and compared that also with a 50-50 blend of dry rolled corn and this rolled high moisture corn. But what we're really comparing to is the same corns, but processed with a hammer mill. And I'll show you that it changes the way the corn looks some in particle size. And then did the same thing, fed either dry corn, high moisture corn processed that with the hammer mill, or a 50-50 blend of those two at the time of feeding. So diets had 70% corn in all cases. Again, the blend would have 35 dry and 35 high moisture. All diets had 20% distillers. Again, it's on a dry matter basis, so trying to mimic what we think people are feeding today, which is probably in that ballpark of 15 to 20% of the dry matter. Corn stalks is a rough feed source, and then supplement that provided minerals and vitamins and additives. So here's a picture of the of the corns, and this is the hammer mill dry corn, the rolled with the Automatic Ag, the rolled dry rolled corn, the same rolled with the Automatic Ag roller mill, high moisture corn at the time of feeding, and then the hammer milled corns. And you can see that the particle sizes are actually larger on average and also less variable for the roller mill corn. Don't know if that has an impact, as I'll show you here in a minute with performance, but certainly different observation on this hammer mill's got large particles and fine powdered particles in both cases for the high moisture and dry rolled corn. Where a little more uniformity, I would say, in the roller mill that Automatic Ag provided. So I'm going to show you intakes, gain, and feed conversions. So to start with, really no difference in trends on what the effect of dry versus high moisture corn was, but also wasn't a lot of difference between roller mill and hammer mill for overall intakes. Good intakes. These were summer fed yearlings. So the dry rolled corn had 29, and as we went to the rolled high moisture corn, that intake decreased. The same thing happened in the hammer mill, where higher intakes on the dry corn hammer milled and the lower intakes on the high moisture corn. So high moisture corn, which everybody knows, generally speaking, will decrease intakes, and then the 50-50 blend, the red bars in the middle, are kind of intermediate. So now I'm going to set up the same way with the gain and the feed conversion, so you can see how they're set up. The roller mill on the left and hammer mill on the right. Gains, really no impact at all across the processing methods for the roller mill, with the blue bar being the dry rolled corn, again the green, the high moisture rolled corn going into the bunkers. Hammer mill, no difference in the dry corn or the blend, as you can see with these others on the roller. The real difference here is the hammer milled high moisture corn little bit of a drop off in gain and kind of interest. So what happens is when we get to the feed conversions, now there is an interaction depending upon how high moisture corn or dry corn fit and whether it was rolled or hammer mill. So what does it mean? Conversions went from 637 down to 5.88 with the automatic ag roller mill. And you can see that the blend is kind of intermediate. With the hammer mill, no difference between the hammer mill and the automatic ag on this dry corn. Certainly no difference when we feed it as a blend of the high moisture corn and dry corns here in red. The real difference is, notice the hammer milled high moisture corn, not as good at conversions as the improvement we see here with the rolled high moisture corn. And so ultimately about a 5% improvement in conversion when you use the automatic ag roller mill for high moisture corn as compared to the hammer milled high moisture corn. So pretty interesting. Did a lot of other work with that. I've also done some digestion work, which I'm not going to show, but I wanted to point out that we did sample feces in these cattle, and probably not useful to look at it in great depth, except I do want to point out that the lowest percent starch in the feces was for the automatic ag rolled high moisture corn. That is not related to starch digestibility. That's simply the percent starch in the feces, but pretty dramatic reduction in fecal starches between those two high moisture corns, whether it was hammer mill or rolled. Want to switch now away from processing corn, whether that's high moisture dry roll corn, to feeding wheat. This about 30% of the time, at least in the Panhandle and southwestern part of Nebraska, wheat could price in at least being cheaper than corn on a dry ton basis. This was work done out at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center. We looked at basically 4 diets. 2 diets had either 12% distillers, or 2 diets had 30% distillers. And then within, and the reason we want to look at that, I'll explain here in a minute. But then within the 12%, we either fed straight dry corn, dry rolled corn, in this case, in the 12% distillers, it's 67%, or replaced half of that corn on a dry basis with dry rolled wheat. And do want to point out that we processed the wheat through an automatic ag roller, which was brought in and was different roller mill than the dry corn, just because you got to have different settings. Same idea with the 30% distillers, where the corn was either dry rolled corn or it was a 50-50 blend of dry rolled wheat and dry rolled corn. So why did we do that? Well, we thought that, there's been a fair amount of work, I'll say, in the old days with feeding wheat and looking at combinations with corn. But in those days, really not common to feed distillers. We thought if wheat increases some of the challenges of starch use and acidosis, maybe it'll react differently when we have 30% distillers in a diet as compared to 12. All diets, of course, had 15% silage, 6% supplement for minerals and so on. And then within that supplement, which was a liquid supplement, the diet with lower amounts of distillers, and especially with dry corn, had to have urea brought in to get to the 13% protein. The blend at 12% distillers with half of it wheat also had some urea, but less. And then, of course, no supplemental protein with the 30% distillers diet. Here's a picture. Caitlin Colson's the student who worked on this. And this is in our beef report. This is the dry rolled wheat, and you can see the average particle size, and of course the dry rolled corn and the average particle size. So what happened was we were wrong in our hypothesis, and what that means is whether we fed wheat or not did not matter at all whether diets had 12 or 30% distillers. The response was the same. And essentially the response is comparing dry rolled corn to dry rolled wheat blended with dry rolled corn and half of the grain mix did not influence intakes, no statistical difference, did not influence gain, of course, no statistical difference, and didn't have any impact on feed conversion. Numerically, you know, it's a little higher, but statistically, just nothing close to being different. So we have to conclude that based on this, as long as you're feeding between 12 and 30% distillers on a dry basis in the diet, didn't matter how much, at least going up to 50% of your grain mix is dry rolled wheat. Again, this is in our research facility. We're managing acidosis probably fairly well, but a bit surprising that we got identical performance essentially blending up wheat. So now the conclusion there is if wheat's cheaper than corn, you can put it in and should be cost savings. Those months when wheat's not cheaper than corn, obviously wouldn't make sense to do that. But there might be times during certain parts of the year when you're harvesting wheat, corn harvest is delayed yet for a few more months, and or when you have off-spec wheat, feed wheat, that might be very useful. There was an effect of feeding the 12 versus the 30% distillers. And I want to highlight this some because a lot of producers are faced with this struggle of what the price of distillers has been, tight supplies. I understand those issues. But you do, when you go from 30% distillers on average to 12% distillers, we see a decrease in gain, and conversions got a little worse going lower in distillers from 6.1 to almost 6.4. So there are implications to feeding lower amounts of distillers. By the way, over the last few years, we've done quite a bit of work looking at feeding anywhere between 10 and 20% distillers. And this is consistent with that work, that we tend to see a drop in gain and conversions get worse as we decrease distillers to some of these lower inclusions. Okay, now I want to shift to some more recent things with flake corn. To set you up, though, I'm going to show you a little bit of older work and then show you the more recent stuff. Some yards, especially big ones, are going to more flaking and a lot of interest in that. And we want to look at this and how it interacts with when we're feeding distillers grains. So I'm going to show you some of that. This is some work that we did a number of years ago. Kyle Vanderpool did, and we put out in 2006. It's probably the first study where we looked at whole corn, dry rolled corn, high moisture corn, and then steam flake corn. And all these diets have 30% distillers grains in them on a dry basis. So the diet had 60% corn. And when we did this study, you know, the whole corn didn't look as good as processing it, which made some sense. High moisture corn looked a little better than dry rolled corn. That was maybe a little surprised that it was that much better, but about 6% better. But this was really the first study that we had ever done, and I think anybody had ever done, with steam flake corn, where the cattle just didn't, not only, you know, just no response to flaking. And we were really puzzled. Gains dropped off, conversions got worse, and we were a little puzzled why that's happening, because everybody knows you feed steam flake corn, you get better performance than dry rolled corn. So we wanted to look into that, and that's where we delved into, you know, how do distillers and flakes feed together. So this was a follow-up study we did where we added distillers grains. So as you go from left to right, that's adding distillers grains to the diet. And these are feed conversions. In red, this is the response to conversion as we added distillers grains to a dry rolled corn diet. So the grain source in here is dry rolled corn, and we're replacing dry rolled corn with 15, 27.5, or 40% distillers, and conversions got a lot better. We had seen a lot of those responses over the years. The blue line is when we do the same thing, feed 0, 15, 27.5, or 40% distillers with high moisture corn being replaced. And the green line is with steam flake corn. So what does this show? It shows that you get an improvement in conversions with dry corn. You get an improvement with conversions, although a little less improvement, but still large improvement as we replace high moisture corn with distillers. And statistically, this says no difference as we replace flakes with distillers grains. A lot of people in the South thought that Nebraska doesn't know what they're doing, and I understand that. So this is some work. The blue line is looking at feed efficiency. So I apologize, higher numbers better here. This is feed efficiency, so it's gain over feed. So higher is better instead of in conversions where lower is better. So the blue line is a Nebraska summary done by Bremer in 2010. As we add distillers grains in the diet with a dry rolled corn, high moisture corn type diet, we see better efficiencies. In other words, it'd be lower conversions, or in this case, higher efficiencies. Some work out of Texas that Jim McDonald did while he was in Texas showed kind of an opposite response, where as I replaced flakes with distillers, not an improvement, and if anything, efficiency gets worse or conversions would get worse. So some more work we did here, looking at, this was work done at the Panhandle Station as well a number of years ago with Cody Nichols. The red line is looking at diets without distillers in them and either feeding 100% dry rolled corn, the conversion to 5.9, or 100% steam flake corn with a conversion of 5.3. And then we fed blends of those two. So 50-50 blend, 75% dry rolled corn, steam flake corn. So as we added steam flake corn to a dry rolled corn diet, without distillers in there, conversions get better. And that's very typical, and about a 12% improvement, almost exactly what you'd expect. When we had distillers in the diet at 35%, we didn't see any statistical response. The points are what the actual data were, but the line is what the statistics say, and there was no effect. So it was averaging a conversion of 5.3 when we had 35% distillers. So, you know, it looks to us like if you're going to feed a lot of distillers, there's no reason to feed it with a lot of steam flake corn. Now distillers grains inclusions are going down. Prices are higher, supplies are tighter. Both of those things are leading to this. So we wanted to follow up with this. And so this is in our new Nebraska beef report. Same idea as what I just showed, but instead of dry corn, it's high moisture corn. So we fed diets that were basically the grain, 70% of the diet was grain, and it was either high moisture corn straight or straight steam flake corn, and then different amounts or ratios of the two combinations. All diets had 20% distillers. In this case, 6% hay as a roughage source and supplement. Here's the performance. I'm going to show you the graph of the gain and feed conversion. Just want to point out that in this study, intakes weren't influenced statistically as we went from a high moisture corn diet over to steam flake corn. They all ate about the same. Gains, though, did increase as we had more steam flake corn in diet. Notice it's like 3.5 for these two inclusions of 75 to 100% high moisture corn, 3.75 for these two inclusions, and then 3.9. Conversions then kind of stair step down as well. So when we graph that, you can see that they were statistically linear. So even though there's some stair stepping here, it's statistically, it's a linear line, and gains went up as we increased replaced high moisture corn with steam flake corn. Again, these diets had 20% modified distillers. Conversions in here on the right linearly improved as we added steam flake corn, which is a little different than what we saw before. And want to point out, though, that the magnitude goes from a conversion of about 6.4 down to a conversion of about 5.9 in this study. This study that I want to share then lastly about steam flake corn has not been published yet. It finished later in the year last year, and so it'll be coming out in our next beef report. We fed 0 distillers and then either 10, 20, and 30% modified, or 0 distillers and 10, 20, and 30% wet distillers grains. And notice in each case, as we added distillers grains, whether it was modified or wet, we replaced steam flake corn. So instead of having dry rolled high moisture corn like most of our previous studies, this is replacing steam flake corn. This is some work that Braden Troyer's done as well as part of his degree. Roughage source in this case was 15% silage. This was a pen study, okay, so larger numbers. And just want to point out, we did add bypass protein. We added protein as we fed less distillers to make sure that protein is not limiting in our controls. So I'm just going to show you the gain and the feed conversions from that study. Do want to point out, notice my y-axis doesn't go to 0, so I'm really focused in on gains between 3.5 and 4.5 because that's where the means were. These cattle did really well. Again, they were performing very well with gain. So if I fed just steam flake corn, the cattle gained about 3.8 pounds a day. As I added either wet, which is in red, or modified, which is in blue, gains increased, and it was kind of curvilinear. Okay, so increased more dramatically going to 10, some more by going to 20, and not a lot more by going to 30% distillers grain. So pretty nice gain response, which we had not seen as dramatically in the past. Conversions, then the blue line is modified as we go from steam flake corn and add in 10, 20, or 30% modified. The red is as we go from steam flake corn and add in 10, 20, or 30% wet. So like we've seen in the past with high moisture and dry rolled corn, wet distillers grains, at least fed out here at 30%, appears to be better than feeding modified. So wetter distillers is better than drier distillers. But also a pretty nice linear response or improvement in conversions as we fed wet distillers grains replacing steam flake corn in this study. So we're kind of puzzled and want to keep working on this, but just trying to always make sure we have information on how distillers feeds and all these different combinations and diets. Okay, I'm going to shift then to the second part of the corn and grain processing and so on, and that's looking at inogen corn. We've done a lot of studies. In fact, it's been 6 different experiments, I believe, and covered a lot of pens of cattle. And I put these numbers on here so I wouldn't forget. We've got different numbers of pens where we've looked at feeding inogen corn or not in diets with no distillers. We've looked at feeding inogen corn or not in diets with 15, 18, 20, or 30% distillers. And this is gain, which wasn't really impacted by whether we feed inogen corn or not. But I want to set it up because then I'll show you feed conversions here next. There's 8 pens compared to each other. So 8 pens fed non-inogen, 8 pens fed inogen corn here at the 0, 6 and 6, 36 pens both ways here in this comparison at 18% distillers, 6 pens at 20, and 8 pens with 30% distillers, looking at feeding inogen corn or not. And we kind of summarize them using a statistical process to see if there's a difference. So first off, with gain, no impacts really of whether you feed inogen corn or not. As we feed more distillers, gains go up. Again, that's not a shock. And this, by the way, is all of the corn processed as just dry rolled corn. Okay, so dry rolled corn fed as inogen corn or not an effect due to inogen trait, but certainly as we feed more distillers, gains go up. What's interesting is, and I apologize, this is actually feed to gain, not gain to feed. So feed conversions. The purple line here is non-inogen fed corn. The greenish line is inogen corn. And remember, there's different numbers of pens in these comparisons, but this is all statistically pooled across all those experiments to get to the bottom line. And what we had been seeing in our studies was some variable responses to feeding inogen or not. And it appears that you get a nice improvement of almost 4.5 to 5% improvement in feed conversion by feeding inogen corn in diets without distillers grains in them. So a bigger response. As we add distillers, this line gets a little better for inogen corn and gets dramatically better for non-inogen corn. And so by the time you get out here to feeding corn or not, it wouldn't matter whether it's inogen or not, you're going to get the same feed conversion as dry rolled corn. Still an improvement of about 2.5% if I have 15% distillers, a little less, but still significant improvement if I feed 18%. And just because of less pens and a smaller response, it's not significant at 20, although I think the lines are what are more important than these actual numbers. So that's our best estimate of why we've seen some variability in trials across different experiments is usually because we've had different inclusions of distillers grains, and it appears to affect our overall response. So as we feed less distillers, maybe if we're feeding 15% or less, it makes more sense than to be approaching whether to feed indigen corn, grow it and feed it, and so on, and get this response in feed conversion. When we look at sweet bran, so that's all with distillers grains diets. As we look at sweet bran, we've only looked at a couple of inclusions of Cargill's wet corn gluten feed product called sweet bran. Nice response in both gain, not statistically as significant, but that's probably due to low numbers of replications. And I would call it significant when we look at the feed conversion response. Feed conversion is roughly going from about 6.3 to 6, or 6.2.5, 6.26 to just under 6. So about the same improvement in both cases by feeding indigen corn. So it looks to me like if you're going to feed indigen corn, you're going to see an improvement if you process it as dry rolled corn and feed it with either sweet bran. Probably works the same then with gluten feed, for example, out of Columbus, and or with less than 15% distillers grains. We have studied indigen corn and processed it as high moisture corn and saw no improvements or no changes. And so, our recommendation currently is if you're going to grow indigen corn, it's best to see, if you want to see a response to feeding it or an improvement, then it's best to process it as dry rolled corn. Okay, I'm going to shift then to, got two more brief topics to talk about. One is feeding corn silage and liver abscesses. We've done some work and really want to, it's pretty interesting, I think, on what's the effect of feeding more silage and does that influence liver abscesses. Everybody's probably well aware of this issue, right? But liver abscesses is a challenge for us. It's an indication of some rumen health and acidosis response. Clearly noticed though at the time of slaughter. And there's different severities of abscesses with some multiple abscesses, some with less and then none. The number one way to control liver abscesses, of course, is to feed tylosin. And by the way, it's very effective. This is an Elanco summary from years ago. Okay, so summarized probably more than 15 years ago. They had 40 trials looking at feeding Tylan or not. And, small changes in gain and conversions, but really it's all about the liver abscesses here. You decrease liver abscesses from 28% to 7.5% based on their 40 trial summary from more than 15 years ago. We've done a couple of studies more recently. This is one from about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that Nathan Meyer did. And I just want to briefly show you what these are. So we fed a corn-based diet with rumensin and Tylan. We fed distillers grains in the diet at 30%, but with no rumensin and Tylan. We fed distillers grains at 30% with rumensin. We fed distillers grains at 30% with rumensin and Tylan. And then we fed distillers grains at 30% with even more rumensin and the same amount of Tylan. So what happened? This is liver abscesses. Total liver abscesses feeding a corn-based diet with rumensin and Tylan was 17%. If we fed distillers grains in the diet at 30%, but now pulled out the rumensin and Tylan, 42%, 41% if we put in just rumensin, drops to 8% if we feed Tylan, and 9% if we feed more rumensin and the same amount of Tylan. So what jumps out? Tylan, lower, lower, lower. No Tylan, quite high. And that same trend happens with the more severe abscesses. So this is total abscesses. This is the most severe category called A pluses. So again, very effective. Okay, on top of that, though, we've been looking at feeding more and more silage. And we think that if you're a smaller operator in terms of growing your own feed or can purchase your silage from your neighbors correctly, and price it correctly, there's some real economic opportunities to feed more silage to finishing cattle than what we traditionally feed. So we had been doing a fair amount of work in that regard, And in all those studies, we just fed Thailand. So the first thing I want to show is we summarized these different experiments with cattle, fed different amounts of time. And I'll show you that. But most of them with small pen studies, and then feeding silage at kind of a normal level as a roughage source of about 15%, and then 3 times normal, or about 45%. And is there an effect of that on liver abscesses? So Hannah Wilson summarized that. Remember, all cattle are fed Thailand, okay? And when we looked at this across those small pen studies, feeding 15% silage, average abscess rate was 8%, cutting about half to 4% when we fed 45% silage. So it looked like there's a small indication here, but going from 8% to 4% is not a huge improvement. But remember, all cattle were fed Thailand. So we got some funding from the Iowa Beef Council as part of their producer supported checkoff, in addition to the normal checkoff, and use that research funding to study this question, because really this could be a benefit across the region for some of our farmer feeders that may feed more silage. So we had diets with 15% silage without Thailand, 15% silage with Thailand, 45% silage without Thailand, and 45% silage with Thailand. These had 20 head per pen, so it's pretty good numbers, and a lot of pens per treatment. So obviously we were feeding a blend of high moisture and dry rolled corn in both cases, but either 15 or 45% silage. Of course, the Thailand was put in the supplement, which were also colored or not based on Thailand inclusion. If you're going to feed 45% silage, they're going to gain slower. The average daily gains do go down, but you can also feed them a little heavier to get to the equal fatness. And so I want to point out that we did feed the cattle 45% silage for 28 days more. And so days on feed went from 185 on these calf fed 15%, same calf feds, but fed 45%. We extended the feeding period 28 days. We did get them all slaughtered at the same back fat. Okay. This is feed efficiency. I wasn't the main part of what I want to show here, because we've done a lot of studies to quantify this. I apologize. Again, this is feed efficiency, so higher is better. So cattle fed 15% silage have a higher feed efficiency. You could look at that. They'd have a lower conversion than cattle fed 45% silage. That's been shown, and we've quantified that response quite well. Interestingly, there is an efficiency response to feeding Thailand in diets with 15% silage versus diets with 15% silage without Thailand. No response to feeding Thailand or not in the 45% silage. Main point of the study was liver abscesses, and here's what those show. If I feed 15% silage without Thailand, we had a total abscess rate of 34.5%. If I added Thailand, it was very effective at helping that, and dropped it to 19. But notice when I go to 45% silage with or without Thailand, liver abscesses, not statistically different than just feeding Thailand, but average 12 to 12.7, and really no effect numerically or otherwise to feeding Thailand. So feeding 45% silage was quite effective at lowering abscess rates. This shows you the breakdown. The red shaded component is the most severe abscessed livers, and Thailand helps decrease not just the amount, but also the red component, and silage kind of the same thing, but also feeding Thailand dramatically, looks like there's less severe abscesses too. So Thailand's effective at lowering the number or percentage as well as the severity of abscesses. Silage was too, of course. Okay, the last thing I want to share, I think, that I have on my plan is little information, a little bit out there on a new feed product. We've been doing some work testing various things, and one of the things that we've been testing is ways to feed cattle differently and manipulate the fatty acid profile of the meat itself. And so this was a study. We actually used a feed product, and were approached by a Korean company that has a feed that they had claimed and had seen some data from Korea that showed it was effective at changing the fatty acid profile of the meat. So it's called Green Grass is the name of the feed product. The company's Senseo Omega. So we fed 0, 10, 20, or 30% of this product from Korea. This study again was done out at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center, and the cattle were fed from basically over the summer into the late fall. As we added green grass to the diet, it's replacing corn, and it resulted in increased intakes. Gains were not statistically impacted, although you can see there's a little noise there. And then feed conversions kind of went from 6.8 up to 7.2, then kind of back down to 7, and then back up to 7.25. That was significantly quadratic. So it's kind of an increase and then leveled off for either the 10, 20, or 30% of that. So this didn't help performance, but remember the goal was really to see what does it do to the omega-3 fatty acid profile. So when those cattle were slaughtered, some of the meat was sampled and brought back here to campus and worked with Chris Calkins, and we quantified the fatty acid profiles. I'm choosing to just show you the omega-3 fatty acid, and it increased. This was actually published in the 2020 Nebraska Beef Report by Mitch Norman. We've done some follow-up work to that. And the reason we did follow-up work is that cattle are not what they eat when it comes to fat. The microbes in the rumen can change the fats and actually do quite often, especially if they're not protected from the fat, they'll change it. And so we wanted to make sure we were seeing this show up in the meat, but we wanted to also kind of quantify how much is getting to the small intestine and intact compared to being manipulated. So we did do, Axel Wiseman did some follow-up work, and is kind of getting ready to present these things now, and will be in our next beef report. We fed 0, 10, 20, or 30% green grass in that study. We've looked at this in a metabolism work and didn't study 0, 10, 20, 30. We studied 0, 15, and 30 because of the size of the study. You want to get as few treatments and as many cattle on it as you can. And not a lot there. We didn't see any major differences in digestibility. Maybe when we get to 30, a little bit of drop off in total digestibility of organic matter and dry matter. A little, no effect really on forage between the 15 and 30, but a little bit better fiber digestibility with the green grass. And digestible energy contents increased as we added green grass to the diet. And that's that's an energy amount per day as well as energy per unit of diet. Again, ultimately, the main goal was what's the effect on fatty acids? And so this is the concentration of fats. So this is expressed as a percent of the total fat. What's the percent of these fatty acids that I'm going to show you that gets to the small intestine? So to start with, saturated fatty acids kind of stayed the same and then dropped off at the 30%. Unsaturated fatty acids kind of stayed the same at 0 and 15 and then increased. So we are getting more unsaturated fatty acids to the small intestine by feeding green grass. That's primarily monounsaturated, but also some polyunsaturated fatty acids. And ultimately down here is the omega-6 fatty acids and the omega-3 fatty acids. And you can see it goes from about 0.25% of the total fat getting to the small intestine to just under 2% of the fat getting to the small intestine. That was percents. This is now the amounts, okay? So the amounts also go up in total fat that gets to the small intestine, and therefore about a 10-fold increase in omega-3 fatty acids amount that get to the small intestine. So it's effective at getting it to the small intestine. Last thing I want to end with, and yesterday had Ruth on our webinar series. We've hired new faculty. Ichi Zong's a precision livestock management position, doing a lot of work on technology and development, and we can bring some of that to bear, hopefully in the feedlot industry. Pablo Loza, I think, is on the webinar today. Is just arrived in Scotts Bluff and getting started there in the feedlot nutrition position. Casey McCarthy is also, I think she's new, although it's been over a year in our cow-calf area. So pretty excited about our future and hiring people to try and help us continue to do better and more in the beef focused area. Okay, I think I will stop there and would be delighted to take any questions if anybody's still on. I don't see anything in the chat box. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute and ask. Any questions people have? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.